It is basically every bit as serious as thermonuclear war. We thought that was really serious. Now, you could argue that was silly. We spent 50 years worrying about that, and we never had one. I would argue maybe one of the reasons we never had one is that we worried about it for 50 years.
We all know that coal is polluting the planet. It's a simple fact that coal is responsible for around 30% of the globe's carbon dioxide emissions, the majority of which arise from burning coal for power. But the big polluting companies are feeling relaxed. What do you think is the time frame in which coal will remain a viable way of generating power on the planet?
Our view is here on out. It's not going to change.
And why should they worry? Despite the urgent warnings of dangerous climate change, coal's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions just keeps on growing.
In a period of hundreds of millions of years, with enormous pressure and heat, the Earth formed petroleum from decayed living matter. And in less than 150 years, by many estimates, we have bled the planet of roughly half of its oil. We have extracted roughly 1 trillion barrels of oil since the late 19th century. Now, most of the remaining oil on Earth lies underground in less industrially developed countries. In order to get that oil, and to get it as cheaply as possible, Western companies have devastated environments and caused terrible human suffering. People in Western societies are largely unaware of the harm caused from oil extraction. We are unaware because it goes unreported. Now we are confronted by the prospect of world peak oil. Peak oil is the point in time where the quantity of petroleum extracted from the Earth begins to irreversibly decline. As fossil fuels are so deeply intertwined in our existence, particularly our food production, the results could be catastrophic, especially in the face of rapidly rising oil demand. And as oil becomes scarce and prices rise, the environmental destruction and human suffering will likely increase. And the competition for oil will get more aggressive.
One of the most common questions that people ask is, do you think that the peak oil that you write about is going to produce a global catastrophe? And my answer is, it already has. There are people dying right now as we're speaking. There are people dying right now over oil. There are governments being twisted and changed and seized over oil. The climate is changing because of oil. And there's a small group of very, very wealthy people who are getting richer and richer because of oil.
As population rose, so did consumption levels, driven mostly by Western industrialized nations. Our dependence on petroleum grew to roughly 1.3 trillion gallons per year, along with our dependence on an equal amount of energy from a combination of coal and natural gas. That amount of oil, stacked in 5-gallon containers, would reach to the moon over 250 times in a single year. Fossil fuels provide energy for production and transportation of virtually every product we own or consume. And many of those products are actually made from petroleum. To get an idea of how deeply embedded fossil fuels are in our everyday products, let's take the example of a nylon shirt. Nylon itself is made from crude oil. An enormous amount of energy is used throughout the process of creating the shirt, almost all of it fossil fuel energy. First, the crude oil is extracted from the ground. Then it is shipped to a refinery where it is distilled into chemicals that make nylon. The polymers are shipped to a factory to create the nylon thread. The thread is then shipped overseas, where using machinery and labor, the shirt is made. Then it is shipped back to North America and trucked to a store. The consumer drives a car to the store, buys the shirt, and drives back home. The shirt is not only made of oil, it's awash in oil. A similar trail of energy use can be followed for nearly every product we consume.
One of the foundational myths of our culture is based on a truth and a lie. The truth is that if you're naked and hungry and outdoors and it's cold and raining, you're unhappy. I think we can all agree on that. And if somebody brings you in and gives you clothing and sets you next to a fire and gives you a big bowl of soup, you go from being unhappy to happy real quickly. Your basic needs are met. So that's the truth. The lie is that, well, if that amount of stuff will make you that happy, then twice as much stuff will make you twice as happy. 10 times as much stuff will make you 10 times as happy. 100 times as much stuff will make you 100. 1,000 times as much. 1,000,000 times as much. And Bill Gates lives in a state of perpetual bliss. That's the lie. It's one of the things that is driving us to destroy this earth and ourselves.
Well, there's actually been polling over many decades in happiness levels of various populations. If you look at the polls today as opposed to the polls in the 1950s, Americans are just about as happy on average as they were 50 years ago. And yet consumption levels have tripled during that period. The American way of life, to put it bluntly, is not sustainable. This quote of George I in Rio de Janeiro at the Earth Summit in 1992 was that the American way of life was not open for negotiation at that summit. And at the same time, he was very prominently sort of speeding around in his speedboat off of Maine, and that sort of epitomizing the American way of life. I think that that does really represent a big challenge in terms of the U.S. relationship to the rest of the world. The very heavy, disproportionate use of resources in the U.S. is very well known and understood throughout the world, and it's one of the things that the U.S. is resented for.
When I hear our leaders tell us that the American way of life is non-negotiable, the first response that comes to my mind is, well, yeah, maybe, but beyond a certain point, nature doesn't negotiate. We may want to maintain the American way of life indefinitely into the future, but the fact of the matter is it's just not in the cards. The world does not have the resource base to enable us to maintain this way of life. And ultimately, that's a good thing. I mean, if you could imagine the rest of the world attempting to live as we are indefinitely, the consequence would be the destruction of the biosphere.